Some of the most celebrated features in automotive design history are now completely illegal to manufacture. Not obscure failures, not experimental prototypes. Features that defined entire generations of vehicles, features that sold millions of cars, features that people still talk about with genuine affection. And when you understand what they were doing to human faces and skulls in collisions, you will understand exactly why they had to disappear. Number 17 is something almost every car made before the late 60s had, and the pattern it created during windshield impacts became a blueprint for facial reconstruction surgeons. Subscribe now because this is the kind of information nobody tells you until it is way too late. Tempered glass windshields. Before 1937, nearly every car on the road used regular plate glass for the windshield. Beautiful clarity, perfect optical quality, cheap to manufacture. In a collision, it shattered into massive jagged shards that would slice through faces like surgical scalpels. The edges were razor sharp. The fragments were large enough to stay coherent as they cut. Drivers would lose eyes, noses, entire sections of jaw. The cutting pattern followed stress lines in the glass that radiated from the impact point, creating long vertical and horizontal lacerations that intersected at the bridge of the nose and across the cheekbones. Laminated safety glass became mandatory in 1938, sandwiching a layer of plastic between two layers of glass so that when it broke, the fragments stayed stuck to the plastic layer instead of flying into your face. What was lost was that perfect clarity, that sense of looking through nothing at all. Early safety glass had a greenish tint and would occasionally delaminate in hot climates, creating bubbles and distortions. Beautiful to look through, absolutely devastating to collide with. And those long intersecting cuts became so common that doctors developed specific techniques just to reconstruct faces damaged by windshield glass patterns. Non-collapsible steering columns. The steering column in cars built before 1968 was a solid steel shaft that ran from the steering wheel straight down to the steering gearbox with zero ability to compress or collapse. Gorgeous engineering. Simple, mechanical, direct. In a frontal collision, the engine and front end would crumple backward, shoving that steel column directly into the driver's chest and face. The rim of the steering wheel would catch the driver across the jaw and nose. The column itself would crush the sternum and ribs. The impact would drive the wheel backward with enough force to detach the lower jaw from the skull or cave in the entire front of the face. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 204 required collapsible steering columns starting in 1968, mandating that the column compress or break away during impact, instead of transmitting force directly into the driver. What was lost was that direct mechanical connection, that feeling of the road coming straight up through the column into your hands with nothing dampening it. Modern columns have multiple breakaway points and telescoping sections that feel slightly vague by comparison. Elegant design, directly responsible for thousands of maxillofacial fractures per year. And the steering wheel rim created a signature injury pattern that emergency room doctors could identify instantly. Dashboard-mounted rearview mirrors with rigid metal frames. Before side impact standards tightened in the 1990s, rearview mirrors were often mounted on heavy metal stems or frames bolted directly to the top of the metal dashboard. Solid construction, adjustable, built to last forever. In a collision, unbelted passengers or drivers would pitch forward and strike the mirror assembly face first. The metal frame would catch them across the forehead, nose, and chin, creating a three-point impact pattern that fractured facial bones in a characteristic way. The bridge of the nose would collapse, the forehead would split open, the chin would fracture vertically. Regulations now require breakaway mirror mounts and prohibit rigid metal frames in the passenger compartment. Mirrors must detach or collapse under a specified force threshold. What was lost was the satisfying solidity of those old mirrors, the way you could grab them and adjust them and they would stay exactly where you put them. Modern mirrors feel flimsy by comparison because they are designed to give way. Built like a small anvil, mounted exactly where your face would go. And that three-point fracture pattern appeared so frequently that it got a name in trauma literature. If you're the kind of person who wonders why things are the way they are, why modern cars feel overbuilt, and why old cars feel dangerously simple, I have put together a complete decade-by-decade timeline of every major automotive safety regulation, what it replaced, and the specific crash data that made it mandatory. It is organized by year and includes the actual federal standard numbers and testing requirements. Grab it at the link in the description. Sun visors with exposed metal edges and rigid mounting brackets. The sun visors in cars from the 1950s through 70s were often trimmed with exposed metal edges and mounted on stiff metal brackets that did not give under impact. Clean styling, functional, lasted the life of the vehicle. During side impacts or rollovers, occupants would strike the visor edge with their temples or foreheads. The metal edge would create a linear fracture across the skull or a deep laceration that split the skin down to the bone. The mounting bracket would catch the side of the face and crush the orbital bone around the eye socket. Current standards require padded visors with no exposed metal and breakaway mounts that detach under impact. The edges must be rounded and covered. The brackets must release before reaching force thresholds that cause skull fractures. What was lost was the architectural simplicity of those old visors, the way they were just a piece of metal and cardboard doing one job and doing it forever. Modern visors feel cheap because they are made to crumble. Simple and clean, positioned exactly at temple height, and the linear skull fractures they caused were so distinctive that forensic analysts could identify them from autopsy reports alone. Windshield-mounted ornaments and hood ornaments tall enough to contact the glass. Rolls-Royce Spirit of Ecstasy, Jaguar Leaping Cat, Pontiac hood-mounted Native American Chief. These were not decorations. These were brand identity rendered in chrome-plated steel or pot metal, mounted high enough to be visible from the driver's seat. In a pedestrian collision, the ornament would strike the victim first, concentrating force into a small, sharp point. In a vehicle collision where the hood buckled upward, that ornament could punch through the windshield and strike the driver's face. The mounting post created a secondary impact point that fractured cheekbones and eye sockets. European pedestrian safety standards now prohibit any hood-mounted projections that do not collapse or retract under impact. In the United States, similar standards took effect through NHTSA testing protocols in the 2000s. What was lost was the entire vocabulary of automotive identity. Cars had faces. They had names, they had sculptures that said who they were. Modern cars are smooth and anonymous by regulation. Iconic and beautiful, designed with zero consideration for what happens when 6 pounds of metal moving at 40 miles per hour meets a human face. And the entry wounds they created were small, deep, and catastrophic. Dashboard padding regulations and the elimination of hard metal surfaces. Cars built before 1967 had dashboards made of painted steel. No padding, no give, just a flat expanse of metal trimmed with chrome. It looked clean, it looked modern, it looked like the inside of an aircraft. In a collision, your face would meet that metal surface at whatever speed the car had been traveling. The impact would fracture every bone in the face simultaneously. The nose would collapse backward into the skull, the cheekbones would shatter, the jaw would dislocate, the forehead would split open. There was no energy absorption, no crumpling, nothing to slow you down before you hit. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 201 required energy-absorbing materials on all interior surfaces starting in 1967. Dashboards had to give under impact. Padding became mandatory. What was lost was the aesthetic purity of those interiors, the uncluttered machine beauty of metal and glass and nothing else. Modern dashboards feel soft and plasticky because they are designed to compress and spread impact force over time instead of stopping you instantly. Gorgeous to look at, mechanically identical to hitting a wall with your face. And the fracture patterns were so severe that survival often meant years of reconstructive surgery. Rear-facing third-row jump seats in station wagons with no head restraints or belts. These were standard in wagons from the 50s through the 80s. Kids loved them. You sat backward, watched the cars behind you, made faces at drivers, felt like you were in your own private compartment. In a rear-end collision, you took the full impact with nothing behind you but a thin piece of metal and a window. No headrest to stop your head from snapping backward, no belt to hold you in place, no crumple zone. Your skull would hit the glass or the metal frame. Your neck would hyperextend beyond anatomical limits. The glass would shatter inward, and because you were facing it, the fragments would hit your face directly. Federal regulations now require head restraints, three-point belts, and specific crash testing for all seating positions. Rear-facing seats without proper restraints are illegal in new vehicles. What was lost was the magic of those seats, the specific childhood joy of riding backward and feeling like you were getting away with something. No modern car offers anything like it. The best part of any road trip if you were 7, a catastrophic design if you were unlucky enough to be rear-ended. And the whiplash injuries were compounded by facial lacerations from glass that had nowhere to go but straight into the occupant. Pop-up headlights with sharp leading edges and rigid mechanisms. These defined sports cars from the 60s through the 2000s. Mazda Miata, Corvette C5, Toyota Supra, Lamborghini Countach, Ferrari F40. Sleek hidden arrow when the lights were down, mechanical theater when they flipped up. In a pedestrian collision, those sharp-edged housings would strike the victim's legs, hips, or face depending on height and point of impact. The mechanisms were rigid, they did not collapse. They transferred force directly into bone. European pedestrian safety regulations introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s required that any frontal projection collapse or retract under impact, and pop-up headlights could not meet that standard. They were phased out globally by 2004. What was lost was the face of an entire era of sports cars. Nothing looks like that anymore. Modern cars are smooth and soft-edged because the regulations require it. Safety absolutely had to win, and it still stings a little. Beautiful and iconic, impossible to make safe for pedestrians, and those sharp housing edges created fracture patterns that matched the shape of the mechanism perfectly. Windshield washer fluid reservoirs mounted against the firewall directly behind the windshield. In older cars, the washer fluid reservoir was often a glass or rigid plastic bottle mounted on the firewall just behind the windshield. Simple, accessible, easy to refill. In a frontal collision, the engine and firewall would compress backward, crushing the reservoir and forcing the contents forward. If the windshield had already cracked, the fluid would spray directly into the cabin. If the fluid contained methanol, which many formulations did, it would contact skin, eyes, and open wounds, causing chemical burns and temporary blindness. The broken reservoir itself became a projectile inside the engine bay, sometimes puncturing the firewall and entering the passenger compartment. Regulations now require washer reservoirs to be mounted low and away from potential crush zones, with impact-resistant construction and non-toxic fluid formulations. What was lost was the convenience of being able to reach the reservoir from under the hood without crawling under the car or removing panels. Modern placements are safer and massively less convenient, simple and practical, positioned exactly where it could become a pressurized chemical hazard. And the combination of methanol and broken glass created injuries that emergency responders were not prepared to treat in the field. Rigid steel dashboard bezels around instrument clusters with exposed edges. The instrument cluster in cars from the 50s and 60s was often surrounded by a chromed steel bezel with sharp edges and corners, mounted rigidly to the metal dashboard. Beautiful industrial design, precise, jewel-like. In a collision, the driver's face would impact that bezel. The sharp corners would catch the cheekbone, temple, or eye socket. The edge would slice through skin and crush bone. The chrome plating would flake off and embed itself in the wound. Current regulations require that all surfaces within head impact zones be padded or recessed, with no sharp edges or rigid projections. Instrument clusters must be surrounded by soft materials that compress under impact. What was lost was the tactile and visual quality of real metal surrounding real instruments. Modern clusters are plastic and soft and feel cheaper because they are designed to give way. Precision craftsmanship, mounted exactly where your face would go in a front-end collision. And the chrome fragments that embedded in facial wounds would cause infections that delayed healing for months. Ashtrays and cigarette lighters mounted on the center of the dashboard within the head impact zone. Before center consoles became standard, ashtrays and lighters were mounted on the dashboard itself, often directly in the center. Spring-loaded metal ashtrays, lighters that glowed red-hot. In a side-impact collision, the passenger would pitch sideways and strike the ashtray or lighter assembly. The spring mechanism would release, and the metal tray would catch the face. The lighter element, if it had been used recently, would still be hot enough to cause burns. The metal housing would fracture cheekbones and orbital sockets. Regulations now prohibit any rigid or heated projections in head impact zones. Ashtrays and lighters, where they still exist, are recessed into consoles or armrests. What was lost was the centrality of smoking to car culture, the idea that every car came with the tools to smoke built in as standard equipment. Modern cars treat smoking like an afterthought because culturally and legally it is convenient and normalized, capable of burning and fracturing your face in a single impact. And the combination of thermal and blunt trauma created injuries that were difficult to categorize and treat. Non-laminated side windows and rear windows that shattered into large, sharp fragments. Before side impact standards evolved, side windows and rear windows were made of tempered glass that would shatter into chunks rather than powder. The chunks were smaller than plate glass, but still large enough and sharp enough to cause deep lacerations. In a side collision or rollover, the glass would explode inward, and the occupants would be struck by dozens of fragments simultaneously. The fragments would embed in the face, neck, and scalp. The cutting pattern followed the stress fractures in the glass, creating dozens of parallel lacerations across the face. Regulations now require that side glass shatter into small, relatively harmless pebbles, and many vehicles use laminated side glass that holds together even when broken. What was lost was the slightly lower cost and weight of non-laminated glass. Modern side glass is heavier and more expensive because it has to stay coherent or break into pieces too small to cause deep cuts. Clear and simple, designed to explode into your face in predictable geometric patterns, and the sheer number of embedded fragments made initial trauma care almost impossible because there were too many wounds to address simultaneously. Windshields designed with flat or near-flat geometry that concentrated impact force into small areas. Early windshields were often flat or only slightly curved, both for manufacturing simplicity and styling. Flat glass was cheaper. It looked modern, it fit the boxy designs of early cars. In a head impact, a flat windshield did not distribute force, it concentrated it. Your face would hit the glass at a single point, and all your momentum would transfer into that point. The glass would fracture in a star pattern radiating from the impact, and the fracture lines would create sharp edges that would slice through skin as your face continued moving forward. Modern windshields are steeply raked and deeply curved, designed to distribute impact force over a larger area and to deflect the head upward and over the vehicle in a pedestrian collision. What was lost was the upright seating position and the visibility that came with a vertical windshield. Modern cars force you to sit lower and farther back because the windshield is part of the crash structure. Simple and clean, optimized to concentrate every pound of impact force into the smallest possible area. And the star fracture pattern became so common that it was used as evidence in forensic reconstructions to show exactly where the face had struck. Decorative metal trim strips running horizontally across the dashboard at face height. Dashboard trim in the 50s and 60s often included chrome or brushed aluminum strips running the full width of the dash. Styling cues borrowed from aircraft and streamlined design. Beautiful, reflective, modern. In a collision, your face would strike that trim strip. The metal edge would catch you across the nose, cheekbones, or forehead, creating a linear fracture or laceration that ran horizontally across the face. The trim strip would peel away from the dashboard and bend, and the sharp, bent edge would cause secondary cuts as your face slid along it. Regulations now prohibit any decorative trim in impact zones that is not recessed, padded, or designed to break away cleanly. What was lost was the sense of occasion that those trim pieces created, the way they made even a basic car interior feel considered and designed. Modern interiors are plastic and padded because the regulations require it. Elegant and stylish, positioned perfectly to slice across your face in a straight line, and the horizontal lacerations were so clean and uniform that they looked almost surgical. Aftermarket steering wheel spinners and suicide knobs mounted on metal stems. These were popular add-ons from the 40s through 70s, especially on trucks and cars without power steering. A metal or plastic knob mounted on a stem attached to the steering wheel rim, allowing you to spin the wheel with one hand, practical for parking. Cool looking. Illegal in many jurisdictions now because in a collision, the knob becomes a projectile or a puncture hazard. If your hand was on it during impact, the knob would be driven into your palm or wrist, fracturing bones and tearing tendons. If your face struck it, the knob would concentrate force into a small circular area, fracturing the cheekbone or eye socket. Many states now prohibit them on vehicles without specific exemptions. What was lost was the ease of one-handed steering, and the style of those old spinner knobs with custom designs and logos. Modern power steering makes them unnecessary. Functional and popular, designed to turn a steering wheel into a weapon in a collision. And the circular impact pattern they created was so distinct that investigators could tell immediately what had caused the injury. Unpadded A-pillars and roof rails made of exposed steel. The A-pillars, the roof rails, every structural member you could see or touch inside a car built before the 70s was bare metal, sometimes painted, sometimes trimmed in vinyl, but always hard. Clean design, honest structure. You could see what was holding the car together. In a side impact or rollover, occupants would strike those pillars with their heads. The steel would fracture skulls. The edges would create deep lacerations. The impact would cause traumatic brain injuries even when the skull did not fracture because there was zero energy absorption. Regulations now require padding on all roof pillars and rails within head impact zones. The padding must meet specific crush and energy absorption standards. What was lost was the visual honesty of the structure, the sense that you were inside a machine where every part had a purpose you could see. Modern cars hide everything under padding and plastic, structurally pure. Mechanically identical to hitting a steel beam with your head at full speed. And the lack of padding meant that even minor impacts could cause injuries that would be trivial in a modern vehicle. Metal window cranks and door handles that protruded into the passenger compartment. Before power windows, every car had metal window cranks. Before modern flush handles, doors had metal levers or pull handles that stuck out. In a side collision, those handles and cranks would catch the occupant. The crank would puncture the ribs or abdomen. The door handle would catch the hip or shoulder and fracture it. If your face struck the window crank, it would create a puncture wound or a crushing fracture depending on angle. Regulations now require recessed or flush handles and prohibit any interior projections that could cause puncture injuries in a side impact. What was lost was the satisfying mechanical feedback of rolling down a window by hand, the specific effort and sound of it. Modern power windows are convenient and completely numb by comparison, simple and functional. Perfectly positioned to punch through soft tissue in a collision. And the puncture wounds they created were deep, narrow, and prone to internal bleeding that was not immediately visible. Glove box doors that opened downward with metal latches and no dampening. The glove box in older cars was a metal door that dropped open on a hinge, held closed by a metal latch. No soft close mechanism, no padding on the inside of the door. In a collision, the latch would fail and the door would swing open. If the passenger's knees were near the glove box, the door would strike them. If the passenger pitched forward, their face or chest would strike the open metal edge of the door. The latch mechanism itself, if it broke off, became a sharp metal projection. Regulations now require that glove boxes either remain latched during impact or open in a way that does not create a hard edge in the impact zone. What was lost was the simplicity of a mechanical latch and a metal door. Modern glove boxes are plastic and over-engineered because they have to be. Straightforward and cheap, capable of adding a secondary impact to an already catastrophic collision. And the edge of that open door created fractures and lacerations that added to the overall injury count in ways that were not tracked until researchers started looking specifically at secondary impacts. Fuel fillers located behind the license plate or in the rear quarter panel with no rollover protection. In many cars from the 60s and 70s, the fuel filler was located at the rear of the car, sometimes directly behind the license plate with no rollover valve or anti-siphon device. Convenient, symmetrical styling. In a rear-end collision, the fuel tank could rupture and the filler neck would be the weak point. Fuel would spray into the cabin or onto the ground, and if there was any ignition source, the car would catch fire. The occupants, often injured and unable to move quickly, would be trapped. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 301 now requires fuel system integrity in rear impacts, rollover valves to prevent fuel spillage, and filler necks designed to separate cleanly without rupturing the tank. What was lost was the styling simplicity of a centered filler and the slightly easier access. Modern fillers are located in positions that prioritize crash safety over convenience. Clean and simple. A direct path for fuel to reach the passenger compartment in a collision. And the burn injuries from post-crash fires were so severe that even survivors faced lifetimes of pain and disfigurement. Window glass with no film or treatment that would hold fragments together during secondary impacts. Even after laminated windshields became mandatory, side and rear glass remained untreated tempered glass that would shatter completely. In a collision followed by secondary impact or a rollover, that glass would be gone, and occupants would be ejected or struck by objects entering the cabin. The lack of glazing retention meant that even a minor impact could leave the cabin completely open. Regulations now encourage or require laminated side glass in many applications, and all glass must meet retention standards after impact. What was lost was the lower weight and cost of single-layer tempered glass. Modern laminated side glass is heavier and more expensive because it has to hold together even after shattering. Simple and light, designed to disappear completely in a collision, leaving nothing between you and the road. And the ejection injuries that resulted were almost always fatal because unrestrained occupants would be thrown through the empty window frame at full vehicle speed. Metal headrests with rigid mounting posts and no padding designed for impact absorption. Early headrests, when they existed at all, were often just padded metal frames on rigid posts. They were designed to prevent whiplash by stopping rearward head motion, but they were not designed to absorb impact. If you struck the headrest with your face during a secondary impact or unusual collision angle, the metal frame would fracture facial bones. The mounting posts, if they failed, would punch through the seatback and into the rear passenger area. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 202 required energy-absorbing headrests with breakaway mounts starting in the late 60s. What was lost was the minimalist styling of those early headrests, the way they were just a thin padded loop on a pole. Modern headrests are bulky because they contain impact-absorbing structure, minimal and clean. Capable of fracturing your face if the collision did not happen in the exact direction the headrest was designed for. And the mounting post failures created puncture hazards for rear seat passengers that were not discovered until crash testing included multi-occupant scenarios. Dashboard-mounted tissue dispensers, coin holders, and other rigid accessories with metal housings. Aftermarket and factory accessories in the 50s and 60s often included metal-housed tissue boxes, coin dispensers, and map holders mounted directly to the dashboard. Convenient, stylish, practical. In a collision, these would become projectiles or impact points. A metal tissue dispenser striking your face would fracture bones and cause lacerations. A coin holder would spill coins that would become secondary projectiles. The mounting brackets would fail and the entire assembly would fly forward into the occupants. Regulations now prohibit rigid accessories in impact zones, and anything mounted to the dashboard must break away cleanly or be recessed. What was lost was the personalized functionality of those accessories, the way you could equip your car with exactly the small conveniences you wanted. Modern cars hide everything or make it part of the structure, thoughtful and useful. Completely unregulated and untested for crash safety. And the secondary injuries from small projectiles were often what turned a survivable collision into a fatal one because they struck areas that would have otherwise been protected. Every one of these regulations was written in blood, not hypothetical danger, not theoretical risk. Years of preventable deaths and injuries in faces rebuilt one surgery at a time. People who did not make it so that the rest of us would. Next time you are in a modern car and you think about how heavy the doors are, how soft the dashboard feels, how the glass spiderwebs instead of shattering, remember what it replaced. Drop a comment telling me which of these shocked you most, or if you remember riding in cars that had any of these features. Next time I am going deep on safety features that manufacturers quietly removed in the last 10 years that nobody noticed were gone. Things you used to use every day, or thought you did.